We've already had a reasonably eventful morning, and we have one more session this morning that will also focus in different ways on the World War II internments. Our speakers on this session are two law professors. Dean Hashimoto, who is not only a lawyer, he's also a physician, and has done a lot of really fine work in health law, public health related issues, as well as some very good work on the internment. Dean is at Boston College Law School. Our other speaker on this session, who's already been referred to, Eric Muller from the University of North Carolina, who has done a lot of very good work on the internments, as well as some remarkable work in constitutional law and criminal procedure that I know about as well. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Dean, and we'll go from there.
Wish to thank Case Western for putting on this conference. It certainly is a wonderful event. Growing up, my family never talked about the fact that my father was incarcerated in an internment camp in World War II. I don't know quite why. I do remember as a child feeling anxious from time to time, thinking, well, it must be because my dad was in prison somewhere and did something wrong. But it certainly was implicitly understood that this was not a subject which you brought up, for example, at the dinner table. I learned more about the internment, actually, from outside sources. And I remember in high school taking an American history class and reading the textbook and noticing that there were a couple of paragraphs that were devoted to the Japanese internment. I remember that text, at least at that point in time, I thought, wait, this is pretty neutral, not seeming to take sides on the issue. And what I remember most vividly, actually, was the next day when my teacher in American history called on me. And I was totally shocked because he normally lectured or occasionally would call on volunteers. But to call on someone was something that I didn't expect. And he said, Dean, in terms of the Japanese internment in World War II, do you think that it was a good thing? Do you think that it was necessary? And what I remember was stammering. I was just totally stunned, first of all, in terms of being called on. And I didn't know what to say. I wanted to say, no, it wasn't a good thing. But really, I just, quite honestly, just didn't have the background on the issue to give a response. So, I said, I'm not sure. And I remember his quick response, which was, of course it was the right thing to do. It was war, and it worked. And I remember feeling just very perplexed at that point in time and sort of shoving it away in my mind. I really learned about the Japanese internment when I was a law student. In my second summer, I went to work for a medium-sized law firm in San Francisco. And one day, one of the senior partners, Bob Ruskey, took me aside and he said, Dean, I've got this really exciting case that I think you'll want to work on. It's a pro bono case, but it involves the Asian Law Caucus in Oakland, and we think we're going to relitigate the Korematsu case. And it was from there that I really sort of learned in greater detail what the Japanese internment was about. I learned, about the background of the Korematsu case. And most importantly, it really began a series of conversations with my dad in terms of what his experiences were. And amazingly, from those conversations, my dad got very excited about the Japanese internment as a subject and wrote his memoirs on it. For those of you who may not be very familiar with the relitigation of Korematsu, it was based upon a writ of coram nobis, this really ancient writ that is generally ignored. The reason for raising it was that in the prior year, in 1982, there was a congressional commission that came out with a report, Personal Justice Denied. And in that report, the commission concluded that, there really wasn't military necessity, but as what was described here was that there certainly was a problem in terms of racial hatred. There was a failure in leadership. There was war hysteria. And in the course of the committee's investigation, it unearthed some very interesting information that involved the Justice Department at the time in which the Korematsu case was being argued before the Supreme Court. And what we learned by going through those documents was the fact that the Justice Department had significant information that was contrary to the final report that had been submitted on behalf of General DeWitt, which supported the internment. And what the Justice Department had were reports from other government agencies, from the military, especially from the Navy, that seemed to directly contradict what was in the final report. And as you might imagine, the Justice Department was in a rather uneasy position. As you all know, the Justice Department is not your usual litigant in the court in the sense of being able to go all out in terms of being an adversary, but rather because the Justice Department represents all of us. There was an internal debate as to whether to divulge this information that it had from other sources that contradicted the very report that it wanted to rely upon. And so in the end, basically, the Justice Department sort of took a middle ground position. And in what is now a fairly prominent footnote, footnote 2, in its brief to the Supreme Court, what it essentially said is, well, don't rely upon the data and don't rely upon sort of what the final report says in terms of military justification. You can use it for its description of events, for other kinds of information like that, but instead it asked the court to rely upon its brief on the issue of necessity. And so the challenge that was raised by Fred Korematsu in the relitigation of the case was that basically the Justice Department had engaged in an ethical violation. That given its situation, it should have divulged the information to the court rather than to take this other stance, which ended up basically sort of hiding the information. What was really interesting, at least I thought, from that was the fact that the government in the relitigation did not oppose what the Asian Law Caucus was trying to do. It pretty quickly took the position that, it's fine for the court to vacate Fred Korematsu's criminal sentence. But what was, I think, unusual was that it also took the position that, because we're in agreement, there's no need for an evidentiary hearing. In fact, there's no need for a published court opinion from this. As long as you simply accept the fact that the government is not opposed to what Fred wants to do in this particular case. And of course, that created distress on our side of the litigation, because what the litigation was about, in fact, is that we wanted an evidentiary hearing and we wanted a court opinion to address this issue of whether there was medical necessity or not. Fortunately, we got a very good judge. Judge Patel, was a very noted liberal judge in the court, and immediately on the draw, we knew that we're likely to get a very good result here. And indeed, She ruled that, in fact, there would be an evidentiary hearing, and that she would issue an opinion. But what was striking to me, in sort of looking back on that, was what pervades Korematsu and what pervades the Japanese internment when you look back was the large amount of silence, and the perceived need to have silence, whether it be in the families of Issei's and Nisei's, or whether it be in this case where you had the Justice Department opposing a hearing, opposing a court opinion. And what was read out earlier was quite true. In the families of Issei's and Nisei's generally, there was silence. Fred Korematsu's own daughter, his own daughter, did not know about his litigation until she was in high school and learned about it from a social studies report. It's rather astonishing, that someone in that family did not know the role that her father played in that time period. But that was the usual in terms of silence in families. I wanted to show some wooden carvings that my grandfather did when he was in the internment camp, just because, from my childhood, in looking back, these were really the only references to the internment that was available. And, at the time, I had no idea that they were carved when he was in the internment camp. What I liked about it as a child was that, these were pictures of people and animals that seemed very graceful. And what I liked most about them was that both the people and the animals had Japanese eyes. You look at them very closely and go, wow, they have Japanese eyes. And I thought that was really cool as a kid. And that's what I remember as a child, rather than hearing stories from my grandfather, who unfortunately had died by that time, about what actually happened there. The final report by General DeWitt in terms of justifying the internment actually was fairly bare. The report, if you read it, was over 600 pages. Only about a dozen pages were devoted to the military justification for the internment. And what was there actually was fairly slim. And so, a lot of what he offered was basically conclusions like this. In the war in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration. The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. And then he goes on to say, that Japan is allied with Germany and Italy in this struggle is no ground for assuming that any Japanese, barred from assimilation by convention as he is, though born and raised in the United States, will not turn against this nation when the final test of loyalty comes. It therefore follows that along the vital Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. There are indications that those are organized and are ready for concerted action at a favorable opportunity. The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will occur. As I mentioned, my father started writing his memoirs about the internment when I was in law school. And let me just read you some pieces from that. In terms of his description of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack had an immediate impact upon all people of Japanese ancestry in the United States. Newspapers and radio broadcasts spread the hate propaganda to whip up everyone's effort towards winning the war. News media were even differentiating the physical attributes of the Japanese as opposed to other Orientals, so they could be targeted for hate. And then his description of the Merced Assembly Center, where his family were ordered to under this military order. There were high barbed wire fences surrounding the entire area. Tall guard posts with searchlights were erected in several places, and soldiers had orders to shoot, to kill anyone attempting to escape. Most internees were American citizens who had committed no crime, were not given any trial, and yet were imprisoned like convicted felons. So for me, in terms of looking back, I learned a lot. I learned a lot from sort of living through the silence and learning from, the narratives that poured out afterwards, after being involved in the relitigation. I must say that as a law professor, when I look at the precedent that followed Korematsu, in some ways it sort of imitates what was the narratives that was going on sort of in the American community. One line of narratives involves exaggeration, right? Because Korematsu has been noted as establishing a strict scrutiny whenever there are governmental classifications based upon race. And of course, those of us who know the Korematsu opinion know that that cannot be, that that's clearly an exaggeration. This is pre-board, Brown v. Board of Education. So there was exaggeration, what I call hyperbole. There was also what I would call silence or a present absence, that there are a series of cases, if you look at, cases like Reno v. Flores, US v. Salerno, where the very issue raised in Korematsu is re-raised in different contexts. In Reno, the issue was detention of juvenile aliens without any showing of risk to the community. In Salerno, of course, it involved pretrial detention on the basis of future dangerousness. And in those cases, you actually had the court taking a position very similar to the position that it took in Korematsu. But what's very striking is that it doesn't cite Korematsu in support. I want to end by going through these wooden carvings that my father did. And as you can see, this is sort of a typical one, probably an early one involving horses. And then there are ones which I think are later. He became more and more sophisticated in terms of what he carved. These carvings are very typical of art in the internment, in that these were like leftover planks of wood, that were left over from building these camps from scratch. And men having no occupation in these camps basically started organizing groups so that they could engage in artwork like this together. So this is very typical. I think you might be able to see, like the whiskers on the cat is made out of fishing line. And then his carvings became more and more complex, and I think interesting, until you got something like this, in which, wow, there's a lot of depth, there's a lot of stuff going on in terms of dimensions. Now, the one I have to go, when I go visit my parents, I now appreciate this art and always go through that hallway to look at them again. The one piece of art that my parents let me have is actually this one, because of the fact that, from their perspective, it's crude, it's a literal copy of a lithograph that was in that era, a very common lithograph. And you first look at it and maybe it isn't very impressive, but it turns out that it's my favorite one. And why is it my favorite one? Well, my theory is that this represents Thanksgiving in 1942. You have to remember that almost half of the Japanese community in California were farmers. And you remember that the order came out in March of 42. And what was missing for that group, the group that ended up in the internment camps, was the fall harvest. They basically had to give that up. And that was where a lot of the monetary loss occurred. And so this is a very typical Thanksgiving picture. It turns out to be a Northeast Thanksgiving picture, so it's really kind of odd in that sense. But it's kind of neat because, again, you have the farmer and his wife with Japanese eyes. That's the one deviation from the lithograph, and really sort of celebrating what I think was a lost Thanksgiving of 1942.
There wasn't enough room at their makeshift plywood. Okay. I'm wondering if you can turn the volume on that up slightly. Did you hear me? Yeah, he's doing it. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, good morning, everyone. So, I am very pleased to be here at Case. There wasn't enough room at their makeshift. I don't know who that person is who keeps interrupting, but he sounds a lot like me. So I wanted to thank Case Western Reserve. I wanted to thank the Law Review here. I think it's wonderful for me to be back here after many, many years. It's lovely to see my old friend Jonathan Enton again, and to have the privilege of presenting alongside my friend Dean Hashimoto. It's also fitting that it's at Case, because Case was one of the Midwestern universities that did accept Japanese American young men and women from the camps, starting at least in 1944, to come and matriculate here as students. So there's a bit of a relevant history here in Cleveland, as Frank Abe has mentioned to us, but also specifically at this university. It is natural, I think, that when a bunch of lawyers and law professors come together to talk about this time period, this period in history, that we focus on the executive order that launched this tragic episode. And of course, we tend to focus on the Supreme Court opinions that ultimately ratified it, or at least ratified aspects of it. But it's also, I think, very important for us to remember that that story, the story of the executive order, what led to it, and how the court approved it, is not the whole story. Indeed, it's not most of the story. It is really just the very beginning of the story. That focus misses three important things entirely. First, it misses the fact that systems of law and regulation were necessary not just to found the program, to launch it, but to run it day after grinding day over a period of years. It misses the fact that people, many of them lawyers, were required to create and then administer that ongoing program, not in Washington, but in the desolate camps themselves, where Japanese Americans were incarcerated. And thirdly, it misses the fact that all of this had a unique and a devastating set of impacts on the real human lives of the more than 100,000 people whom the executive order touched. Over 20 years in this field, I've gathered stories, unknown stories, from my work in the archives that illustrate this administrative and human infrastructure that followed on the executive order. I've spent a chunk of this year turning a handful of those stories into a podcast that I have called Scapegoat Cities. And today I would like to share with you one episode of that podcast that I think helps to illustrate what I'm trying to bring out here in this story, the story beneath, you might say, or following on Executive Order 9066. And it's a podcast, so normally you just listen to them, but I did create a slideshow that goes along with it that illustrates the story that is being told. It's a story that's set at the Heart Mountain Relocation Center, about which you've already heard. It's the camp, I believe, where, Frank, you said your father was incarcerated. And it's illustrated with photographs, color photographs, very, very rare contemporaneous color photographs that were shot by one of the internees. And in fact, it's the husband of the protagonist of the story that you're about to hear. So I'm going to stop talking here, and you'll start to hear me over the uh, speakers as this moves forward. Okay. There wasn't enough room at their makeshift plywood table for Mary and Bill Mambo to both fill out their questionnaires, so Mary claimed the table and playfully pushed her husband over towards their two pushed-together cots and tossed a pencil after him. It was quiet in their barrack room. Mary's parents had taken their son Billy off their hands for an hour or so to let them focus on the forms. They were 4 pages long, 28 questions, a line for a date and a signature, and below that a reminder that it was a crime to make a false statement to the government. Up to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, it said. Mary looked at the front page. Across the top, in big official-looking typeface, was a caption that read, War Relocation Authority Application for Leave Clearance. It didn't matter what fancy language the government used. Everyone understood what they were really being asked. It was a loyalty test. The government wanted to know who was loyal and who was disloyal so that they could start pushing the loyal people out of the camps to jobs in cities further east and young men into the army. Can you believe this? Mary said to Bill after they had both glanced through the questions. They're trying to figure out whether I'm a loyal citizen, and they're asking me which magazines I like to read? Easy, honey, easy. Bill soothed his wife, something he'd been doing a lot of recently, even though he was kind of near the end of his rope, too. Why don't you tell them you only read top-secret cables from General Tojo and see what they think? He winked at her, and she smiled a weak smile back at him. Her shoulders loosened up a little. Mary had her hackles up about the whole situation. It was March 5th, 1943, the beginning of their 7th month in Unit F of Barracks 7 in Block 28 at Hart Mountain. 7 months cooped up in a 16 by 20 room, 320 square feet for her and Bill and their little 3-year-old boy Billy, who slept in his own cot a few feet away in the opposite corner. Billy was their only child, and in a setup like this, it was pretty clear there wouldn't be any little brothers or sisters coming along anytime soon. There was a newlywed couple in a room to themselves at the far end of their barrack, and though Mary couldn't understand it, they didn't really seem to have any shame at all. Sound traveled easily in these buildings. It was almost like the long space in the barrack rafters was an amplifier, and she could hear them going at it sometimes on a weekend afternoon, and very often at night. The couple were either night owls or tried to wait until very late so as not to disturb the neighbors, but Mary hadn't been sleeping well in camp, and she was often awake to hear the squeaking of the military cot and the rest of it. Maybe unlike Mary, they didn't have any family or friends nearby, she didn't know, but after a late night session, she'd see them the next morning in the mess hall, smiling and saying hello, all chipper as if they'd just gotten the best rest of their lives. Mary knew that she couldn't handle that kind of embarrassment, and frankly, with a child sleeping a few feet away and her parents and younger sister in a unit 2 doors down, it wouldn't have been very enjoyable. Just another piece of life the government had taken from her and her husband. It was all such a jolt, and the further they got from their lives before the war, the angrier Mary got. Since she graduated from trade school in 1933, she'd had a good job making costumes for theater productions, especially the novelty revival of The Drunkard at Theater Mart in Hollywood, which had opened the year she graduated, and to everyone's amazement was still running 9 years later when Mary was sent to Santa Anita and Hart Mountain. Mary's parents were successful vegetable farmers whose specialty crop was rhubarb, a plant whose value was all in the roots that produced a new crop every year and that were probably rotting in the ground now for all they knew. Bill was a pretty darn good auto mechanic who had his own thriving garage in Hollywood, or used to have it anyway. Bill and Mary were solid, working-class people, but with an artistic bent and a certain flash of style. Mary designed and sewed beautiful clothing for her family and her friends. Bill was an amateur photographer, and a good one, who was way ahead in experimenting with Kodachrome when everyone else was still shooting black and white. Maybe in a nod to their bohemian side, they created a playful alias for themselves. Sometimes they went by the last name Mambo. Their real name, M-A-N-B-O, spelled as if it were French, M-A-N-B-E-A-U-X. Mambo. When Bill Mambo used the name Mambu, he wasn't Bill, he was Pierre. Now those hard-working and creative lives were gone, or maybe just upended and suspended. Nobody knew what lay ahead. Mary set to work on her questionnaire. The questions seemed so simple, too simple to really say anything meaningful about who she was, or how she thought of herself, or what her feelings were about the war and America and Japan. It seemed like a farce to her, just one more insult in a long string of them since Pearl Harbor. So when she answered the questions, she let a little bit of her frustration shine through. Maybe more than a little bit. She knew she shouldn't. She knew that it wouldn't do any good, that being sassy wouldn't move some bureaucrat reading her answers to some epiphany about what a raw deal she'd been handed. But she couldn't help herself. So when a question asked her to write down her citizenship, she wrote U.S., but then modified it by saying at present, and she added that she was doubtful of it. And when a question asked her about her husband Bill's citizenship, she wrote U.S., but then added a question mark. Naturally, she knew they were both citizens, but they sure weren't being treated like it, and she wanted that fact to be noted. And when another question asked her to state her husband's race, she didn't just write Japanese and leave it at that. She wrote that and then added, no fault of our own, am very proud of my race. And when another question asked her whether she wanted to leave camp to work and where she'd want to do it, she wrote down the one place she knew she was forbidden to go, Los Angeles, where, she added, all of her friends were, and where she had gotten her training. And when a question asked her whether she had ever sent any of her children to Japan, and asked her to put a mark above either yes or no, she didn't put a mark. She squeezed her own words into the tiny space on the form, and those words were, no, what for? She was still going through the questions, chewing on her pencil as she thought about how to respond, when Bill, over on their bed, quietly said, Mary, did you get to question 27 yet? She hadn't, but she turned the page and read it out loud. If the opportunity presents itself and you are found qualified, would you be willing to volunteer for the Army Nurse Corps or the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps? Well, this is rich, Mary said. The Army needs nurses so badly, but when my friend Chizu volunteered, and she's a licensed RN, they turned her down because she's a Nisei. And now they turn around and ask us if we'll volunteer into the WAC? They were asking a slightly different question of the men. Bill read it out loud to Mary. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? They just shook their heads. Bill wrote no, just no, plain and simple. He wasn't going to leave his family behind in this godforsaken place. Mary wrote yes, but in the tiny spot for yes or no, she asked her own question in all capital letters. Why was her nurse friend turned away by the Army at a time when so many are needed? She didn't expect anyone to answer that, but it felt good to put it down in writing. Then Mary read question 28 out loud. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign power, government, or organization? Mary threw the pencil onto the floor and stood up sharply, throwing her hands on her hips. I'm not going to do this, Bill. I'm not. I've had it. Obedience to the Emperor? Can you believe this? Bill gently encouraged her just to sit back down, take a couple of deep breaths, finish the form, sign it, and get it behind her. The question was supposed to get a yes or no answer. Mary wrote yes, but then added, I'm a born citizen, after it, to let whoever would be reading the thing know how indignant she was at even being asked such a thing. Bill couldn't answer the question yes or no. He just wasn't sure where he stood anymore. The most he could offer was conditional. Yes, if we get all our rights back. That's what he wrote. They signed their names and wrote the date and put their pencils down and stood up and hugged each other in the center of their little room for a long time, with Mary sniffing back tears of anger or sadness or something else she couldn't say. It'll be all right, Bill told her. It'll be all right. Mary started worrying about her questionnaire from the moment she turned it in. She didn't know who would be reviewing her answers or what they'd be looking for, or how they would turn her answers into some sort of finding about whether she was loyal to the United States. Surely they weren't going to just grade her questionnaire as if it were some high school science test, giving points for right answers and taking away points for wrong ones, and totaling them up and handing out A's for loyalty to the ones who passed, and F's for disloyalty to the ones who failed. But as it turned out, that's pretty much exactly what the government did. And then the government announced that on the basis of the questionnaire, it was going to reassign all of the prisoners in all of the camps, kind of like the way a teacher might reseat disruptive students or send them to detention. The disloyal people from all 10 of the camps would be concentrated at just one of them, Tule Lake in far northern California. The loyal people at Tule Lake would be shipped out to the other 9 camps. This would turn Tule Lake into a segregation camp, a place where the War Relocation Authority could house all of the people they called disloyals and agitators and troublemakers and bad apples. This Great Reshuffling was to take place in the fall of 1943. This news did nothing to ease Mary Mambo's mind. Some of her friends at Heart Mountain, who said they had answered flat-out no to the question about swearing allegiance to the U.S. and forswearing loyalty to Emperor Hirohito, started receiving notices that they would be sent to Tule Lake come September. Others, who hadn't answered the question straight up, were being called in for hearings with camp officials to delve deeper into their answers. Mary was in suspense. What had she done by shooting her mouth off on that form? Would she be sent to Tule Lake? Would she have to abandon her aging parents at Heart Mountain? Had she messed up her young son's life even more than it already was? The Great Reshuffling began in mid-September. Trains full of people from Tule Lake headed south and east to the other 9 camps, and trains full of people from those other camps headed north and west to Tule Lake. The Heart Mountain train to Tule Lake left on September 21st. Bill and Mary Mambo were not on it, but they weren't completely off the hook either. Each of them had gotten an order to come in for a follow-up hearing in the administration building on October 5th, a Friday. When that day came, it was unseasonably warm, hot even, all the way up to 80 degrees, which was just about unheard of for a Wyoming October. Just after lunch, Mary's parents came by to pick up Billy for the afternoon so that Mary and Bill could go to their loyalty hearings. Mary's mother said they were going to take him on a long walk and do some rock hunting up in the hills behind camp, and that they shouldn't worry about him, he'd be fine. Twice, Mary put on dresses she had stitched herself, and twice she took them off. She couldn't decide how a person should present herself when her loyalty was on trial. There was a more casual dress and a more formal one. The more casual one was too hot, and the more formal one was, well, too formal. Only when Bill pointed to his watch did she settle on the casual one. It was hot for a day like today, but she figured she'd be sweating in there no matter what she wore. They took Bill in first. Mary figured it was going to take a while, and she'd brought the Ladies' Home Journal along with her to occupy herself and keep herself from fidgeting. But no more than 15 minutes later, Bill was back out again. He said he thought it had gone okay. They tried to pin him down about why he had said on his questionnaire that he wasn't willing to serve in the armed forces, and they seemed unhappy with his answer to the loyalty question on the form, the spot where he had written, "if we get our rights back," after writing yes. I told him I was just using my freedom of speech, expressing my thoughts, Bill told Mary. But they said there was only one way to express loyalty, and that was to answer yes with no conditions. So I gave him what they wanted. He smiled at her, and he gave her shoulder a little squeeze. Then it was Mary's turn. She was expecting something dramatic, some kind of a courtroom set up. But it was just a little bare room with a desk and 3 chairs, 2 of them occupied by white men who introduced themselves as the camp lawyer and the head of employment. She was wary, but they weren't unfriendly or overbearing. They explained that she had answered the loyalty questions with certain conditions that raised concerns about her sympathies, and that they wanted to follow up on some things. They went over details like whether she spoke Japanese, whether she had ever been to Japan, where her parents and her siblings were, what her religion was, whether she had had Billy baptized, and why she had hesitations about leaving camp for a job. They gave her another chance to say whether she was willing to swear allegiance to the United States. She thought of what her husband had told her out in the waiting area and said that she absolutely was willing to do that. She was a born citizen, she added, and then, hearing how that sounded, realizing that maybe she was getting prickly again like she had on the questionnaire, she told them that she knew she was a little bit on the hot-tempered side and sometimes said things she shouldn't. "We'll try to get along," the lawyer said, but he said it in a good-natured way, and she felt the mood lighten a little. There was a long pause while the men looked through some papers, and Mary suddenly felt as if maybe the hearing was over and she should leave. She went to get up from the chair, but the lawyer motioned her to stay. After a few more seconds, he looked up and smiled. "We don't see any reason for concern here, Mrs. Mambo. We'll send the paperwork along to Washington." And that was that. The cloud of worry lifted. She and Bill and little Billy would not be sent to Tule Lake. She could stay in camp to look after her parents. Back out in the hallway, she threw her arms around Bill and sobbed quietly with relief. "I told you it would be okay," he whispered to her. "I told you." The loyal couple strolled back to their barrack, hand in hand, comparing notes on what they'd been asked and laughing over the dumber questions. The whole ordeal hadn't lasted more than an hour. When they got back to the barrack, Mary's parents were still out on the rock hunt with Billy. They walked to the far end of the barrack, the end where the frisky newlyweds lived, and they listened. All quiet. They made their way along the building, stopping at each unit, hearing no one. Back in their own room, quickly and very quietly, Mary and Pierre Monbeau made love. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thanks to both of you. I think that it is a really large contribution to the discussion to get us beyond simply focusing on the legal doctrines. I mean, I'm reminded of Burke Marshall's reaction to Jack Bass's book, Unlikely Heroes, about some of the Southern judges who actually ruled in favor of civil rights and school desegregation. And Burke Marshall, who had been the head of the Civil Rights Division in the Kennedy administration, said, but the real heroes were the kids and their parents. And I think that both Dean and Eric have made that point in this setting tremendously eloquently. We do have some time for questions. Again, if you have questions, please wait for the mic. But
Thank you, Eric and Dean. That was very moving, both the personal and the narrative. So I think many of us who are here today are looking both at the past and at the present. And you all have a significant advantage of having such a deep understanding of the past. And so I'm curious, for the last 16 years, as you've witnessed a national security hysteria ebb and flow, and knowing what you know about the impact on real lives that the past, or this particular past instance of national security hysteria, imposed, what are some of the similarities that you notice, and then what are also some of the differences, whether it's the ways in which impacted communities are affected, and also the way in which the government or the general public is behaving?
Geez, I guess where I come from on that question is that the Korematsu case and the aftermath sort of represents a lost opportunity to have conversations about issues of national security and race. You know, the silence that occurred in Japanese families sort of matched the silence, I think, as I mentioned in some of these other cases like Salerno, where clearly the court is relying upon, you know, a principle very similar to Korematsu. Now, some may say, well, the fact that they don't cite Korematsu in support is a good thing. But, you know, from my perspective, I would have preferred to have had just a straight-on discussion about Korematsu, recognizing that it is good precedent. And that should be very troubling for us, I think. And the second thing I would say is, you know, the other thing that goes on in terms of exaggerating Korematsu so that now it's transformed itself into an equal protection case, which is, you know, which is ridiculous. The tragedy of that is that you're announcing strict scrutiny, and then the fact that it's Korematsu indicates, well, you have a pretty big exception. You know, if the court did apply strict scrutiny, you know, and carefully looked at the situation, well, that's a bad thing in terms of outcome. So I do think that the silence and the exaggeration sort of leads us to where we are today. And that as a result of that, we were ill prepared to deal, you know, with these issues because of the fact that we never, even though we will all say Korematsu wrongly decided, that doesn't mean anything, you know, unless you debate the harder issues as, you know, what are the real limits on national security during wartime?
So this is obviously a hugely important question, and it's also, I want to say, a very difficult one. And it's hard for me because really my focus in my career has been on what has been a very difficult thing, which is simply trying to understand what happened then in all of its depth, all of its richness, all of its complexity. And so often when I'm asked to compare then to now, I find it hard enough to understand then to be able to really make the comparison. But a few things do jump to mind. I mean, the central thing that jumps to mind is, I think, what was already mentioned earlier, and I think Professor Stone mentioned it earlier, which is that the instinct in times of crisis to look for internal enemies to scapegoat, which is where the title of the podcast comes from, I think is as present today as it was then. I think a lot's changed in some other ways, but I think that that instinct to look inward for others in times of fear, and then to view them through a horribly simplifying lens of race or religion, often a misunderstood lens of race or religion, I think that that is as present today as it was then. And so we need to be on guard for that danger as much now as we were then, or as we weren't then, I guess, and not pat ourselves on the back that we've figured it all out. I do want to mention a couple of differences. You know, one difference is that the Japanese and Japanese American community along the coast in the late 1930s and early 1940s was in a somewhat different position from Arab and Muslim Americans today, in the sense that there was extraordinary geographical isolation, or concentration, I guess I would say, and there was almost complete political dispossession, because the immigrant generation were not allowed to become citizens and could not vote, and the second generation, the Nisei generation, most of them in 1942 were under voting age. It was a very young population, so you had this weird sort of, there was only a very small subset of that Nisei population that could even vote in an election. So they were functionally unrepresented in any government setting anywhere. And while of course that remains true in certain ways, I think for those perceived as today's enemies, there are certainly areas of the country in which there is robust political participation and political representation. I think Arabs and Muslims today, in part because of the experience of 75 years ago, have friends and allies, which Japanese and Japanese Americans, with the exception of the Quakers, mostly didn't have back in those days. The Japanese and Japanese American population along the coast was the target of certain very narrow kinds, in addition to racism, of very targeted economic opportunism, which one can say might be present in certain ways today, but is different from what was the case then. And then, of course, another important difference is that, we've been through the civil rights movement, and, the resistors that Frank Abe told us about were in some ways sort of precursors for the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the draft resistance movement in the Vietnam War, and all of the legal transformations that have cascaded from that. So none of that is to say that we are immune from the mistakes of 75 years ago. But I think it's to say that if we see a recapitulation of them, they're not going to happen the same way. It doesn't need to be concentration camps in order for there to be grievous injustices practiced against both citizens and non-citizens in the United States. The notion of government surveillance was, confined largely to, undercover cops and people reading mail back in those days. Today, we live in the potential of an extraordinary surveillance state, which can be selectively deployed with devastating effect. So I think it's kind of a rich set of differences and similarities that just require a lot of vigilance on our part.
Could you tell us a bit about the circumstances under which that couple went home, what they found, and what their later lives were like?
Yes, I can. Bill, the photographer, late in 1943, had the opportunity to get a job actually it was early 44, to get a job in a foundry in a Midwestern or Eastern/Midwestern city called, what was it called? Cleveland, actually. He came here, and then several months later, once he had gotten established, he called for Mary and little Billy. So in mid-1944, they left and joined him here in Cleveland. And that left only her parents alone in the camp. Her father, who you saw, the gentleman with the little glasses you saw in the images, he had the opportunity, was given the opportunity to work on a farm in New Jersey. There was a firm, frozen food. It was an early frozen foods business called Seabrook Farms that was actively recruiting Japanese talent from the camps because they were such good farmers. So he came east to interview for a position there, and then went back. He got the job. He went back to camp late in 1944 to pick up Mary's mother, his wife. And all alone in camp, she had had a nervous breakdown, and she was in the camp hospital. So they were unable to leave for New Jersey. They were on the last train out of Hart Mountain in November of 1945. So what is that? That's 75 years ago, is it? No, it's, yeah, well, whenever, what is, it's 1945, no, November of 1945, you can do the math. And they went back to what had been their farm. They had had an agreement with the white landlord. They owned their house, but they weren't allowed to own the land. So they rented the farmland, and they had an agreement that the landlord would tend the rhubarb crop, which was their specialty crop, and then return it to them at the end of the war. But that had all been plowed under, and so their rhubarb crop was destroyed. And they actually learned that it turned out that they had been paying rent to their white landlord for years, even though he actually didn't own the land. The land had escheated to the state of California because he had never paid his real estate taxes. So he made off with their rent. They destroyed the rhubarb, and they just tried to put their lives back together. Eventually, Bill was injured at the foundry here in Cleveland, and they went back to Hollywood, California, and he reopened his garage. He had a garage on Vine Street in Hollywood, and they just kind of put their lives back together as best they could. These photographs are the only significant collection of color still images from that time period. And they are color slides, so occasionally after the war, they would do little slideshows for their neighbors, but then the slides were put away and really left boxed up until 6 or 7 years ago when they were discovered.
If there are no other questions, we are actually just about right on time. So let me thank both Dean Hashimoto and Eric Fuller for a wonderful session. We are now going to break for lunch. We will reconvene in this room at 1 o'clock, and we hope you will be here. We'll have sessions on more contemporaneous issues, some national security issues, immigration issues, and then we'll have a concluding session. So thanks all. We'll see you at 1 o'clock.